I'm student nurse Diana, and today we are going to cover the nervous system. So I'm going to share my screen. Um, the second edition of Understanding Anatomy and Physiology by Gale Sloan Thompson. The slides, I believe, are dated 2018, so they're the most current that I was able to locate. So I will go ahead and try to coordinate the slides with the book. In the book, I'll be starting on page 159. Chapter 10, Nervous System. There are more nerve cells in the human body than there are stars in the Milky Way. To remain in balance, homeostasis, the various organ systems of the body must work together. Even an act as simple as eating lunch requires input from multiple body systems, including the endocrine system, which senses a drop in blood glucose levels and triggers the sensation of hunger, the muscular system, which allows you to chew your food, and the digestive system, which processes the food and eliminates the waste. The nervous system coordinates these systems so each knows exactly what to do and when to do it. The nervous system, consisting of the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, constantly receives signals about changes within the body as well as the external environment. It then processes the information, decides on what action needs to occur, and sends electrical and chemical signals to the cells, telling them how to respond. The nervous system also powers our ability to learn, feel, create, and experience emotion. Of all the body systems, the nervous system is the most complex. Overview of the nervous system. The body has two organ systems dedicated to coordinating the activities of trillions of cells making up the human form. One of those systems, the endocrine system, employs chemical messengers called hormones to communicate with cells. In contrast, the nervous system uses electrical signals to transmit messages at lightning speed. The nervous system has three essential roles. Sensing, number one, the nervous system uses sense organs and nerve endings to detect changes both inside and outside the body. Number two, the nervous system processes the information received, relates it to past experiences, and determines what response is appropriate. Number three, responding. The nervous system issues commands to muscles and glands to initiate changes based on its information. Fast fact. During fetal development, neurons grow at a rate of about 250,000 neurons per minute. The nervous system contains two main divisions, the central nervous system, CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, PNS. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of the vast network of nerves throughout the body. Fast fact. The study of the nervous system is called neurobiology. In brief, the peripheral nervous system consists of everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. However, because the nervous system performs so many different functions, it's helpful to further subdivide the peripheral nervous system as shown in the chart on the screen. So it divides the peripheral nervous system into two, the sensory or the afferent division, and which that carries signals from the nerve endings to the CNS, and then the motor or efferent division, which transmits information from the CNS to the rest of the body. So the afferent division, which carries signals from the nerve endings to the central nervous system, consists of somatic sensory, which carries signals from the skin, bones, joints, and muscles, as well as the visceral sensory, which carries signals from the viscera of the heart, lungs, stomach, and bladder. Under the motor or efferent division, which transmits information from the CNS out to the rest of the body, that would be the somatic motor, which allows voluntary movements of skeletal muscles, as well as the autonomic motor, which provides automatic activities such as control of blood pressure and heart rate. And the autonomic motor is further broken down into the sympathetic, which arouses the body for action, which would be the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which has a calming effect, is more the let's relax and plan things type of division. So on page 161, two types of cells make up the nervous system: neurons and neuroglia. Neurons are the excitable, impulse-conducting cells that perform the work of the nervous system, while neuroglia protect the neurons. Neuroglia, also called glial cells, neuroglia are the supportive cells of the nervous system. The word glia means glue, and neuroglia do just that. They bind neurons together. They also perform various functions that enhance the performance of the nervous system. Underscoring the importance of neuroglia is the fact that the nervous system contains about 50 glial cells for each neuron. The nervous system contains 5 major types of glia. Diverse in shape as well as function, the following table summarizes each type. Schwann cells are found in the peripheral nervous system. All the rest reside in the central nervous system. So the oligodendrocytes. Well, let me look and see if I can pronounce it. It tells me how to pronounce it in the beginning here. I don't see that. So, oligodendrocytes. Okay, the oligodendrocytes, those form myelin sheath in the brain and the spinal cord. The speed signal conduction. The ependymal cells line the spinal cord and cavities of the brain. Some secrete cerebral spinal fluid, whereas others have cilia that aid fluid circulation. Those are the ependymal cells. Microglia perform phagocytosis, engulfing microorganisms and cellular debris. Astrocytes extend through brain tissue, nourish neurons, help form blood-brain barrier, attach neurons to blood vessels, and provide structural support. Then the Schwann cells, they form myelin sheath around nerves in the PNS, form the neurolemma. Body at work. Star-shaped astrocytes, the most numerous of all glial cells, are pervasive throughout the brain. A tiny foot exists at the end of each of the astrocytes' star-like projections. Some of the feet latch onto a capillary while others connect with a neuron. This arrangement allows the astrocyte to funnel glucose from the bloodstream to the neuron for nourishment. What's more, the feet of the astrocytes join with the endothelial cells lining the walls of the capillaries to create a semi-permeable membrane called the blood-brain barrier, BBB. The BBB, which exists throughout the brain, allows small molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water to diffuse across to the brain, but blocks larger molecules. This helps protect the brain from foreign substances. However, it also prevents most medications from reaching brain tissue, making treating disorders of the brain challenging. The most numerous of all glial cells are A. microglia, B. astrocytes, C. Schwann cells, or D. ependymal cells. And the answer is B. astrocytes. Astrocytes are pervasive throughout the brain and form the blood-brain barrier. On page 161, life lesson, brain tumors. Unlike neurons, which don't undergo mitosis, glial cells retain the ability to divide throughout life. While this allows them to replace worn out or damaged cells, it also makes them susceptible to tumor formation. In fact, most adult brain tumors consist of glial cells. These types of tumors, called gliomas, are highly malignant and grow rapidly. Because of the blood-brain barrier, see Body at Work on this page, most medications aren't effective in treating these tumors, which is why surgery and radiation continue to be treatment mainstays. Certain techniques that may help augment drug delivery to the tumor include administering a concentrated blood sugar solution to make the BBB permeable, injecting drugs directly into the spinal fluid, or implanting a chemotherapy wafer within the brain tissue. Page 162, neurons. Nerve cells, called neurons, handle the nervous system's role of communication. There are three classes of neurons: sensory, which are afferent neurons, interneurons, and motor or efferent neurons. Each neuron type fulfills one of three general functions of the nervous system. Sensory neurons. Sensory or afferent neurons detect stimuli such as touch, pressure, heat, cold, or chemicals, and then transmit information about the stimuli to the CNS. Interneurons, which are found only in the CNS, connect the incoming sensory pathways with the outgoing motor pathways. Besides receiving, processing, and storing information, the connections made by these neurons make each of us unique in how we think, feel, and act. Motor neurons, or efferent neurons, relay messages from the brain, which the brain emits in response to the stimuli, to the muscle or gland cells. types of neurons. Neurons vary greatly in both size and shape. They also vary according to the type, number, and length of projections. Multipolar neurons. Multipolar neurons have one axon and multiple dendrites. This is the most common type of neuron and includes most neurons of the brain and spinal cord. Bipolar neurons have two processes, an axon and a dendrite with the cell body in between the two processes. These neurons can be found in the retina of the eye and olfactory nerve in the nose. Unipolar neurons. Unipolar neurons have one process, an axon, that extends from the cell body before reaching into a T shape. These neurons mostly reside in the sensory nerves of the peripheral nervous system. Fast fact, about 90% of the body's neurons are interneurons. Neuron structure. Neurons are perhaps the most diverse of all body cells, assuming a variety of shapes and sizes. In general, though, neurons have three basic parts, a cell body and two extensions called an axon and a dendrite. The cell body, also called the soma, is the control center of the neuron and contains the nucleus. Dendrites, which look like the bare branches of a tree, receive signals from other neurons and conduct the information to the cell body. Some neurons have only one dendrite, others have thousands. The axon, which carries nerve signals away from the cell body, is longer than the dendrites and contains only a few branches, or contains few branches. Nerve cells have only one axon. However, the length of the fiber can range from a few millimeters to as much as a meter. That is one single axon that could be a meter long. That is something you don't want to sever because trying to regrow something a meter long is going to take a long, long time. It may not be possible. The axons of many, but not all neurons, are encased in a myelin sheath, consisting mostly of lipid. Myelin acts to insulate the axon. In the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells form the myelin sheath. In the CNS, oligodendrocytes assume this role. Oligodendrocytes assume this role in the CNS. For more information, see myelin on the next page. Gaps in the myelin sheath, called nodes of Ranvier, occur at evenly spaced intervals. The end of each axon branches extensively, with each axon terminal ending in a synaptic knob. Within the synaptic knobs are the vesicles containing a neurotransmitter. Fast fact, the sciatic nerve contains the longest axon in the body. It extends from the base of the spine to the big toe in each foot. That is mind-blowing. That has got to be incredibly long and thin, right? I mean, oh my gosh, myelin, okay, page 164. Not all nerve fibers are myelinated. However, because myelin helps speed impulse conduction, unmyelinated fibers conduct nerve impulses more slowly. Typically, unmyelinated nerve fibers perform functions in which speed isn't essential, such as stimulating the secretion of stomach acid. In contrast, nerve fibers stimulating skeletal muscles, where speed is more important, are myelinated. In the peripheral nervous system, the myelin sheath is formed when Schwann cells wrap themselves around the axon, laying down multiple layers of cell membrane. It's these inside layers that form the myelin sheath. The nucleus and most of the cytoplasm of the Schwann cell are located in the outermost layer. This outer layer is called the neurolemma. It is essential for an injured nerve to regenerate. In the CNS, the myelin sheath is formed by oligodendrocytes. Unlike Schwann cells, which wrap themselves completely around one axon, one oligodendrocyte forms the myelin sheath for several axons. Specifically, the nucleus of the cell is located away from the myelin sheath, and outward projections from the cell wrap around the axons of nearby nerves. As a result, there is no neurolemma, which prevents injured CNS neurons from regenerating. This explains why paralysis resulting from a severed spinal cord is currently permanent, although researchers continue to explore possible solutions. The body at work. Although myelination begins during the 14th week of fetal development, it is not complete until late adolescence. In fact, at birth, very few of the neurons in a newborn's brain are myelinated. During infancy and childhood, however, myelination proceeds rapidly. For this to occur properly, children need an adequate supply of dietary fat. Remember, myelin is mostly fat. That's why children younger than age 2 should never be placed on a low-fat diet. Page 165, repair of nerve fibers. Actually, I'm going to ask this question here. Let's see. Which neurons detect sensations such as touch or heat and relay information about the stimuli to the central nervous system? Is it A, the efferent neurons, B, the interneurons, C, afferent neurons, or D, Schwann cells? The answer is C, afferent neurons, because efferent neurons are motor neurons and relay messages from the brain to muscles and gland cells. Interneurons connect incoming sensory pathways with outgoing motor pathways in the central nervous system, and Schwann cells form the myelin sheath. Impulse conduction. Well, we're not there yet in the book, so I'm going to read about the repair of nerve fibers. When nerves are injured, such as from a cut, crushing injury, or some other type of trauma, their ability to repair themselves depends upon the extent of the injury as well as their location. Nerves in the peripheral nervous system can regenerate as long as the soma and neurolemma are intact. Because nerves to the central nervous system lack a neurolemma, they cannot regenerate. Therefore, most injuries to the brain and spinal cord cause permanent damage. The following figures illustrate the repair process in a somatic motor neuron. Number 1, when a nerve fiber is cut, the distal portion of the axon is separated from its source of nutrition. Consequently, it begins to degenerate along with the myelin sheath and Schwann cells. Macrophages move in to clean up the resulting debris. Number 2, Because the muscle fibers normally innervated by the nerve are deprived of nervous input, they begin to atrophy or shrink. Meanwhile, the severed portion of the axon sprouts new growth processes. At the same time, the neurolema forms a tunnel near the site of the injury. New Schwann cells grow within the tunnel. Number 3, when one of the new growth processes finds its way into the tunnel, it begins to grow rapidly, like 3 to 5 millimeters per day. At that point, the other growth processes begin to retract. Number 4, the new fiber continues to grow, guided by the tunnel until it reestablishes contact with the muscle. After that occurs, the re-innervated muscle fibers they do regrow. Okay, life lesson, nerve injuries. When a peripheral nerve is severed, neurosurgeons may try to realign the nerve ends surgically. If the severed ends aren't adjacent to one another, the surgeon may use a nerve or vein graft to bridge the gap. Success with these techniques is variable, however. Another method currently being researched is the use of synthetic guidance channels to help direct newly growing axons. The channels may be implanted empty or they may be filled with growth factors or neural cells. Impulse conduction. To relay messages to organs and tissues throughout the body, nerves must initiate and then transmit signals from one neuron to the next neuron at lightning speed. Signal transmission occurs through an electrical current, which, like all electrical currents, results from the flow of charged particles from one point to another. In the body, whenever ions with opposite electrical charges are separated by a membrane, the, the potential exists for them to move toward one another, depending, of course, upon the permeability of the membrane. This is called membrane potential. A membrane that exhibits membrane potential, an excess of positive ions on one side of the membrane, and an excess of negative ions on the other side, is said to be polarized. 1. Resting potential. Inside a cell has negative charge. Outside has positive charge. Exterior rich in sodium, which is positive. Interior rich in potassium, which is positive. That was step 1. Okay. When a neuron is not conducting an electrical signal, its interior has a negative electrical charge, while the charge on the outside is positive. The outside of the cell is rich with sodium ions, Na+, which is positive, while the inside contains an abundance of potassium ions, K+. The interior of the cell contains other ions as well, particularly large, negatively charged proteins and nucleic acids. These additional particles give the cell's interior its overall negative charge. Because of the membrane's permeability, a certain amount of sodium and potassium ions leak across the membrane. However, the sodium-potassium pump constantly works to restore the ions to the appropriate side. For information on the sodium-potassium pump, see Chapter 3, Cells. This state of being inactive and polarized is called resting potential. The neuron is resting, but it has the potential to react if a stimulus comes along. Okay, step 2. Depolarization. Stimulus causes the sodium to enter the cell. Region of interior changes from negative to positive because of the sodium, the Na+, the positive charges entering the cell. When a stimulus such as chemicals, heat, or mechanical pressure comes along, channels on the resting neuron's membrane open and the sodium from outside the membrane rushes into the cell. The addition of all of these positively charged ions changes the charge of a region of the cell's interior from negative to positive. As the membrane becomes more positive, it is said to depolarize. Number 3, action potential. Channels in adjacent areas open and more sodium enters the cell. Nerve impulse continues down the length of the axon. If the depolarization is strong enough, in other words, if the stimulus goes above what is known as the threshold level, adjacent channels also open, allowing even more sodium to flood the cell's interior. This creates an action potential, meaning that the neuron has become active as it conducts an impulse along the axon. Another term for action potential is nerve impulse. The action potential continues down the axon as one segment stimulates the segment next to it. 4, repolarization. Potassium flows out of the cell. Electrical balance restored. Interior has negative charge and exterior has positive charge. Meanwhile, the sudden influx of sodium triggers the opening of other channels to allow potassium to flow out of the cell. Soon after potassium begins to exit, the sodium channels shut to prevent any more sodium from flowing into the cell. This repolarizes the cell. However, sodium and potassium are now flip-flopped, with the outside containing more potassium and the inside containing more sodium. The refractory period. Although the membrane is polarized, the neuron won't respond to a new stimulus as long as the sodium and potassium are on the wrong sides of the membrane. This is known as the refractory period. The sodium-potassium pump works to return sodium to the outside and potassium to the inside. When this is completed, the nerve is again polarized and in resting potential until it receives another stimulus. So the refractory period 5, membrane is polarized, but sodium and potassium are on the wrong sides of the membrane. The sodium-potassium pump works to restore ions to the rightful sides. So that's 1, and then 2, depolarization, 3, action potential, 4, repolarization, and 5, the refractory. So now we're going to view this, this animation.
To relay messages to organs and tissues throughout the body, nerves must initiate and then transmit signals from one neuron to the next neuron at light.
Okay, I have to wait just to make this work right.
To relay messages to organs and tissues throughout the body, nerves must initiate and then transmit signals from one neuron to the next neuron at lightning speed. Signal transmission occurs through an electrical current. When a neuron is not conducting an electrical signal, its interior has a negative electrical charge, whereas the charge on the outside is positive. The outside of the cell is rich with sodium ions, whereas the inside contains an abundance of potassium ions. The interior of the cell also contains large, negatively charged proteins and nucleic acids. These additional particles give the cell's interior its overall negative charge. Because of the membrane's permeability, a certain amount of sodium and potassium ions leak across the membrane. However, the sodium-potassium pump constantly works to restore the ions to the appropriate side. This state of being inactive and polarized is called resting potential. The neuron is resting, but it has the potential to react if a stimulus comes along. When a stimulus comes along, channels on the resting neuron's membrane open, and the sodium from outside the membrane rushes into the cell. The addition of all these positively charged ions changes the charge of a region of the cell's interior from negative to positive. As the membrane becomes more positive, it is said to depolarize. If the stimulus is strong enough, adjacent channels also open, allowing even more sodium to flood the cell's interior. This creates an action potential, meaning that the neuron has become active as it conducts an impulse along the axon. The sudden influx of sodium triggers the opening of other channels to allow potassium to flow out of the cell. Soon after potassium begins to exit, the sodium channels shut to prevent any more sodium from flowing into the cell. This repolarizes the cell. However, the outside now contains more potassium, and the inside contains more sodium. Although the membrane is polarized, the neuron will not respond to a new stimulus as long as the sodium and potassium are on the wrong sides of the membrane. The sodium-potassium pump works to return sodium to the outside and potassium to the inside. This is known as the refractory period. When the sodium-potassium pump restores sodium ions to the outside of the cell and potassium ions to the inside of the cell, the nerve is again polarized. It remains in resting potential until it receives another stimulus.
The body at work. Action potential is an all or nothing event. When a stimulus reaches a threshold and depolarizes the neuron fires at its maximum voltage. If the stimulus doesn't reach the threshold, the neuron doesn't fire at all. What's more, a stronger stimulus doesn't produce a stronger response. In this way, as each neuron segment triggers firing in the segment next to it, the nerve impulse continues at the same strength all the way to the synaptic knobs. 168. Impulse conduction in myelinated fibers. Nerve impulses move through unmyelinated fibers as previously described. In myelinated fibers, however, the thick layer of myelin encasing the axons of most nerve fibers blocks the free movement of ions across the cell membrane. The only place ion exchange can occur is at the nodes of Ranvier, the evenly spaced gaps in myelin. The following illustration shows how a nerve impulse travels down a myelinated fiber. Electrical changes occur at the nodes of Ranvier, creating an action potential. The current flows under the myelin sheath to the next node, where it triggers another action potential. This process continues as the signal moves down the axon. Because the action potentials occur only at the nodes, the impulse seems to leap from node to node. This type of signal conduction is called saltatory conduction. The word saltatory comes from the Latin word saltere, which means to leap. Fast fact. Neurons can transmit impulses amazingly fast, up to 120 meters per second, or 268 miles per hour. Life lesson: multiple sclerosis, or MS, Multiple sclerosis is a disease in which the myelin sheaths surrounding the nerves of the CNS deteriorate and are replaced by hard scar tissue called plaques. These changes disrupt nerve conduction and cause symptoms that vary depending on which nerves are affected. Common symptoms include visual disturbances such as blindness or double vision, weakness, loss of coordination, and speech disturbances. The disease progresses over many years. Symptoms typically improve and then worsen in an unpredictable cycle. MS tends to, tends to strike women between the ages of 20 and 40 years. Although the exact cause is unknown, experts speculate that a virus may trigger an autoimmune reaction in which the patient's immune system attacks the myelin of the CNS. There is no known cure.
The axons of many neurons are encased in a myelin sheath. Consisting mostly of lipid, myelin acts to insulate the axon. The thick layer of myelin blocks the free movement of ions across the cell membrane. The only place ion exchange can occur is at the nodes of Ranvier, the evenly spaced gaps in myelin. Electrical changes occur at the nodes of Ranvier, creating an action potential. The current flows under the myelin sheath to the next node, where it triggers another action potential. This process continues as the signal moves down the axon. Because the action potentials occur only at the nodes, the impulse seems to leap from node to node. This type of signal conduction is called saltatory conduction.
What is another term for nerve impulse? Is it A, repolarization, B, resting potential, C, depolarization, or D, action potential? The answer is D, action potential. The rationale is that repolarization is when the nerve cell restores its electrical balance in preparation for a new stimulus, and the resting potential is when the neuron is resting but has the potential to react. And depolarization occurs as the membrane becomes more positive. Synapses, page 169. Nerve impulses usually travel through several different neurons before reaching their target organs or tissue. For this to happen, the impulse must have some way of transferring from one neuron to the next. The area where this occurs is called a synapse. Chapter 9 discussed the synapses that occur between nerves and muscles. Now we'll examine the synapses that occur between two neurons. Some synapses, such as those between cardiac muscle cells and certain types of smooth tissue cells, are electrical. In these instances, adjacent neurons touch, which allows an action potential to pass smoothly from one neuron to the next. More commonly, synapses are chemical. In these instances, the two neurons don't touch. Instead, a chemical called a neurotransmitter bridges a very narrow gap, the synaptic cleft, to carry the message from the first neuron, the presynaptic neuron, to the next, the postsynaptic neuron. Although greatly simplified, here's basically what happens. Number one, when an action potential reaches a synaptic knob, the membrane depolarizes. This causes ion channels to open, which allows calcium ions to enter the cell. Number two, the infusion of calcium causes vesicles to fuse with the plasma membrane and then release their store of a neurotransmitter into the synapse. Number 3, once released, the neurotransmitter binds to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. Each neurotransmitter has a specific receptor. For example, the neurotransmitter epinephrine can bind only to receptors specific to epinephrine. Number 4, the specific neurotransmitter determines whether the impulse continues, called excitation, or whether it is stopped, called inhibition. If the neurotransmitter is excitatory, as shown here, sodium channels open, the membrane becomes depolarized, and the impulse continues. If the impulse is inhibitory, potassium channels open and the impulse stops. Number 5, the receptor then releases the neurotransmitter, after which it is reabsorbed by the synaptic knobs and recycled or destroyed by enzymes, as shown here. Fast fact: scientists have discovered more than 100 different neurotransmitters in the human body. Some common neurotransmitters include acetylcholine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, and histamine. Fast fact: one neuron can have multiple synapses. In fact, in a particular portion of the brain, one neuron can have up to 100,000 synapses.
Nerve impulses usually travel through several different neurons before reaching their target organ or tissue. For this to happen, the impulse must have some way of transferring from the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of another neuron. The area where this occurs is called a synapse. Most synapses do not touch. Instead, a chemical called a neurotransmitter bridges a very narrow gap called the synaptic cleft to carry the message from the first neuron, called the presynaptic neuron, to the next, called the postsynaptic neuron. The process begins when an action potential reaches a synaptic knob and the membrane depolarizes. This causes ion channels to open, which allows calcium ions to enter the cell. The infusion of calcium causes vesicles to release their store of a neurotransmitter, such as acetylcholine, into the synapse. Once released, the neurotransmitter binds to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. This causes sodium channels to open and sodium diffuses into the cell. The addition of the positively charged cells causes the membrane to depolarize, and the impulse continues. The receptor then releases the neurotransmitter, after which it is reabsorbed by the synaptic knobs and recycled or destroyed by enzymes.
Spinal cord and somatic reflexes. The spinal cord is the information passageway that relays messages from the brain to the rest of the body. 31 pairs of spinal nerves branch out from the spinal cord, linking it to the far reaches of the body. Although the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, the peripheral nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. The two are inseparable. Fast fact: the spinal cord is as wide as your finger and extends for about 17 inches or 43 centimeters. Nerves from the cervical region of the spinal cord innervate the chest, head, neck, shoulders, arms, hands, and diaphragm. So that's at the very top here, in your neck area. Nerves from the thoracic region extend to the intercostal muscles of the rib cage, the abdominal muscles, and the back muscles. The lumbar spinal nerves innervate the lower abdominal wall and parts of the thighs and legs. Nerves from the sacral region extend to the thighs, buttocks, skin of the legs and feet, and anal and genital regions. Extending from the end of the spinal cord is a bundle of nerve roots called the cauda equina, so named because it looks like a horse's tail. Basically a bundle of nerve fibers, the spinal cord extends from the base of the brain until about the first lumbar vertebra. The body at work. Early in fetal development, the spinal cord extends all the way down the vertebral column. However, the vertebral column grows faster than the spinal cord, and by the time a baby is born, the spinal cord ends at about the level of L3. By adulthood, the spinal cord extends only as far as L1. This explains why lumbar punctures, procedures in which a needle is inserted into the spinal canal to withdraw cerebral spinal fluid for analysis, are performed between L3 and L4. At that location, there's no danger of nicking the spinal cord with a needle. Structure of the spinal cord. The spinal cord sits inside a protective bony tunnel created by the stacked vertebra. A cross-section clearly shows the two types of nervous tissue, white matter and gray matter, that make up the spinal cord. Gray matter, which appears gray because of its lack of myelin, contains mostly the cell bodies of motor neurons and interneurons. This H-shaped mass is divided into two sets of horns, the posterior or dorsal horns and the ventral or anterior horns. White matter appears white because of its abundance of myelin. It contains bundles of axons called tracts that carry impulses from one part of the nervous system to another. A small space called the epidural space lies between the outer covering of the spinal cord and the vertebrae. It contains a cushioning layer of fat as well as blood vessels and connective tissue. A minute opening called the central canal carries cerebrospinal fluid through the spinal cord. Attachment of spinal nerves. Spinal nerves travel through gaps between the vertebrae, which are held apart by intervertebral discs and attached to the spinal cord by way of two roots, the dorsal and the ventral roots. The dorsal posterior nerve root contains fibers that carry sensory information into the spinal cord. It enters the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Cell bodies of the dorsal neurons are clustered in a knot-like structure called a ganglion. A spinal nerve is a single nerve resulting from the fusion of the dorsal and ventral nerve roots. Because the nerve contains both sensory and motor fibers, meaning it can transmit impulses in two directions, it is called a mixed nerve. Fibers in the ventral or anterior nerve roots exit from the ventral horn to carry motor information out of the spinal cord. The pia mater is the innermost layer This transparent membrane clings to the outer surface of the brain and spinal cord. It also contains blood vessels. The subarachnoid space lies between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. It is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. The arachnoid mater, a delicate layer resembling a cobweb, lies between the dura mater and the pia mater. The dura mater is the tough outer layer. Meninges of the spinal cord. In addition to the bony projection offered by the vertebrae, the spinal cord is further protected by 3 layers of fibrous connective tissue called the meninges. The meninges also covers the brain. The 3 layers of the meninges from the inside out are the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. Page 172, spinal tracts. Within the white matter of the spinal cord are bundles of axons called tracts that serve as the routes of communication to and from the brain. All the nerve fibers of a single tract have a similar origination, destination, and function. As an example, the fibers of the spinothalamic tract originate in the spinal cord, spino, and end in the thalamus, thalamic. In addition, they all convey sensations of pain, touch, and temperature to the thalamus in the brain. Some of the most important tracts are highlighted in the figure below. Note, all tracts exist on both sides of the spinal cord, but in this illustration, the ascending tracts are highlighted on the left and the descending tracts on the right. Ascending tracts convey sensory signals such as pain up the spinal cord to the brain. Descending tracts conduct motor impulses down the spinal cord to skeletal muscles. The dorsal column relays sensations of deep pressure and vibration, as well as those needed to create awareness of the body's position, proprioception. The spinocerebellar tract is responsible for proprioception. The spinothalamic tract relays sensations of temperature, pressure, pain, and touch. The corticospinal tracts, also called the pyramidal tracts, are responsible for fine movements of hands, fingers, feet, and toes on the opposite side of the body. The extrapyramidal tracts are a group of tracts associated with balance and muscle tone. The body at work. Most of the spinal cord tracts cross from one side of the body to the other in the brainstem. This is called decussation. For example, sensory signals from the right side of the body are sent to the left side of the brain. Also, motor signals being sent to the right side of the body originate on the left side of the brain. This is why someone who suffers a stroke affecting motor centers in their left side of the brain will have weakness or paralysis on the right side of the body, and vice versa. That makes sense. To remember the difference between ascending and descending tracts, think about this. When you step on a nail, The sensation of pain ascends to your brain, ascending sensory. In response, your brain issues an impulse that moves down your foot, telling you to move. Descending is motor. Fast fact, all the axons in a given tract serve one general function. Life lesson, spinal cord injury. Over 10,000 people in the United States suffer from spinal cord injuries each year. Males between the ages of 16 and 30 have the greatest risk, mainly because of their tendency for high-risk behaviors. Most injuries result from car and motorcycle accidents. If the spinal cord is severed, often because of a vertebral fracture, it causes a loss of movement and sensation below the level of the injury. For example, a spinal cord injury between the levels of T1 and L1 causes paralysis in the legs, paraplegia. An injury above the C5 vertebrae causes paralysis in all the limbs, quadriplegia. An injury above C4 is especially serious because this is where the phrenic nerve exits the spinal cord. Because the phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm, an injury here can cause respiratory failure. And I'm going to end this recording now, and I will begin the next, which will be part 2 for the nervous system. I will begin on page 173 for spinal nerves.